Just a 30-minute drive from the border of the European Union sits the village of Minji, Moldova, a place that, for reasons both tragic and shocking, briefly managed to attract international attention. Not for wine or folk festivals, but for the fact that an unusually large number of its residents were selling organs. In one reported case, 16 men were taken to Turkey, fattened up while a buyer was found, and then surgically relieved of one kidney. The recipients often came from countries such as the UK, Canada, or Israel. Each donor woke up with roughly $2,000 in hand and was quickly sent back home. 2 of the 16 later died from complications. Many of the others required costly medical care to survive. One man used his payment to buy a car, a moment of celebration that ended when the vehicle smashed into a tree after a bout of heavy drinking fueled by cheap homemade wine. Exact tallies are hard to get, but estimates suggest more than 130 people in Minji, in a village with fewer than 5,000 residents, had sold kidneys. That's roughly 1 in 38 people. The question this raises is stark: how desperate does a life have to be before a person agrees to sell a body part? And how bare must an economy be for organ selling to become a notable local phenomenon? To answer that, we need to step back and look at Moldova's modern history. At the dawn of the 21st century, the country had endured one of the most dramatic peacetime collapses of living standards and production of any nation in recent memory. By 1998, GDP had fallen to barely a third of its 1990 level, per capita income hovered around $400, comparable to some of the poorest regions on Earth. When your economy collapses that rapidly, survival choices become brutal and immediate. The collapse was not a sudden fluke but the product of decades of geopolitical misfortune and internal mismanagement. Before the turmoil, Moldova had been a relatively prosperous part of the Soviet Union, an agricultural powerhouse with pockets of high-tech manufacturing serving aerospace and military applications. Under Soviet planning, it prospered as a food supplier, a tiny sliver of territory that produced disproportionately large shares of vegetables, fruit, canned food, tobacco, and wine. The state poured capital into agriculture, built schools and hospitals, raised life expectancy, and reduced illiteracy. By mid-century, Moldova was, in Soviet terms, a success story of development. That success, however, came with dangerous structural weaknesses. Industry was concentrated in the eastern strip of Transnistria, the rest of the country remained overwhelmingly agricultural. The Soviet model had depended on access to cheap raw materials, heavily subsidized energy, and guaranteed markets inside a single political economy. When the Soviet Union dissolved, those seams ripped apart. Historical geopolitics made things worse. Bessarabia, the historic core of what we now call Moldova, had been tugged between empires for centuries. In June 1940, exploiting the chaos of World War II and a secret understanding with Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum to Romania and occupied the region. The subsequent decades included violent purges, forced collectivization, and a deliberate campaign to Russify culture and language. The Latin alphabet was banned, Cyrillic imposed, and many Romanian elites suppressed. The wartime years and Stalin-era repressions left physical infrastructure, farmland, and human capital badly damaged, and in some cases permanently altered. Soviet rule did rebuild the economy in specific ways. Massive land reclamation, mechanization, irrigation, and chemical inputs turned Moldovan black earth into an extraordinarily productive agricultural engine. By the 1960s, it was punching far above its weight in food and wine production. Transnistria, in particular, became the industrial heartland. Factories, tractors, textile mills, and energy plants cropped up, manned by specialists often imported from other Soviet republics. The result was a bifurcated Moldova, a rural, Romanian-speaking Bessarabia and an urban, Russian-speaking Transnistria. By the 1980s, the sheen began to fade. The Soviet economy stagnated. Corruption proliferated at the local level. Decades of intensive farming and heavy chemical usage fouled groundwater. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster compounded the public health toll and spawned higher rates of birth defects. Political openings in the late 1980s produced a powerful popular front that demanded sovereignty, the return of the Latin script, and withdrawal of Soviet troops. Independence came in 1991, but it arrived into chaos. The transition from a centrally planned intra-Soviet economy to an independent market economy was brutal. Moldova had depended on Russian fuel, cheap inputs, and predictable trade flows. Overnight, those privileges vanished. Import costs spiked, gasoline and natural gas became dramatically more expensive, coal imports multiplied in cost. Factories built to run on subsidized energy now faced world prices. the country's agricultural export model, tuned to Soviet distribution networks, had to be rebuilt for global trade, with customs, tariffs, and logistics to navigate. The economy contracted at astonishing speed, annual GDP declines almost a decade long, hyperinflation that blew incomes to dust, and a collapse in exports and real wages to a quarter of pre-1990 levels. By 2000 the statistics were grim: mass poverty, hunger, and the highest emigration rates in the region as roughly a quarter of the population fled in search of survival. Political life responded in unexpected ways. In 2001, facing desperation, Moldovans elected the Communist Party back into power, the only post-Soviet state to do so at that time. The motivation was straightforward: many hoped to pivot back toward Russia would restore trade links, ease energy costs, and resolve the Transnistria problem. Initial negotiations with Moscow offered promise, but domestic protests and shifting geopolitics scuppered deals. Subsequent administrations oscillated between pro-Russian and pro-Western rhetoric but rarely succeeded in building robust, transparent institutions. That institutional fragility created fertile ground for oligarchy and corruption. Privatization in the 1990s, carried out with vouchers and rapid sales, should have broadened ownership. On paper, workers received shares and homes, and by the early 1990s large swathes of real estate and companies were nominally privatized. In reality, those processes were often captured by insiders. Low wages, weak oversight, and a judiciary that struggled for independence created incentives for elites to extract wealth rather than reinvest it. Political office became a gateway to personal enrichment, and the oligarchic layer that emerged hollowed out the public good. The most dramatic illustration of this rot came in 2014, when $1 billion vanished from three of Moldova's biggest banks, the equivalent of about an eighth of the country's GDP. The scandal exposed how shell companies, friendly politicians, and cross-border money flows could be used to siphon national wealth out of the country. Bonds were issued by the central bank to cover shortfalls, transferring the cost, in effect, to Moldovan taxpayers for decades to come. The alleged architect of the heist later escaped prosecution and even found electoral success in local politics, a symbol of how impunity had taken root. The economic consequences were devastating. A crippled banking sector cut off Moldova from easy access to international financing. The leu lost value, currency volatility impoverished savers. Foreign direct investment fell, skilled workers left, and the remittances sent home by emigrants became one of the few growth engines. Public spending on health, education, and social protection was slashed to rock-bottom levels. By the late 1990s, public per capita spending on health could be measured in tens of dollars a year. Malnutrition rose, caloric intake dropped, and social indicators plummeted. Moldova briefly became the least happy country in surveys and recorded among the highest per capita alcohol consumption rates, a grim barometer of social despair. The geographic and political fragmentation of the country added another painful dimension. Transnistria's breakaway put an industrial core and vital energy infrastructure outside of central government control. Railways, pipelines, and port access ran through territories that could, and often did, lever economic pressure on Chiinu. Even when agreements existed, the political leverage of an externally backed, well-armed Transnistria complicated effective national economic planning. Yet the story is not purely one of loss. Under Soviet rule, investment and modernization did raise living standards for a time, literacy rates improved, hospitals and schools were built, and Moldova produced agricultural surpluses that sustained many of its citizens. Following independence, reforms like the introduction of the new leu and mass privatizations aimed to stabilize and democratize the economy. For a time, Moldova even received commendation from international institutions for its reforms and liberalization. But these reforms were implemented in an environment of weak institutions, fragile state capacity, and exposure to external shocks, most catastrophically Russia's 1998 default, which halved Moldova's exports almost overnight and sent the currency into a tailspin. Corruption became entrenched across administrations. Political cronyism and the capture of privatized assets by the well-connected meant most gains accrued to a narrow elite while the majority saw living standards fall. When the 2014 banking fraud occurred, it was not an anomaly but a symptom, a political economic system where rules were weak, oversight porous, and vested interests strong. The scandal added billions in contingent liabilities to the public balance sheet, constraining public investment and burdening ordinary citizens with long-term repayments. International aid and EU association agreements have since opened new trade avenues and some agricultural support, but transforming extractive systems into inclusive growth is an uphill battle. Geopolitics remains a constant threat. Moldova sits at the crossroads of competing powers, the European Union to the west and a resurgent Russia to the east. Russian troops remain in Transnistria. The war in neighboring Ukraine has raised legitimate fears of renewed instability or a second front. Those risks keep investors cautious and complicate long-term planning. The human costs have been severe and ongoing. Skilled workers left in droves, doctors, engineers, teachers, producing a demographic hollow that undermines recovery prospects. Families dependent on remittances face volatile incomes. Public services remain underfunded. Pockets of despair, like Minji, become microcosms of a larger failure. When formal institutions fail to provide livelihoods, people resort to desperate, exploitative, and dangerous coping mechanisms. Moldova's predicament is not reducible to a single cause. It is the product of a history that repeatedly exposed the country to external domination, violent disruption, and political capture at crucial moments. It is a nation that inherited Soviet-era industrial geography that privileged one region over another, only to lose much of that industrial base through secession and war. It is a society in which reforms and privatizations were implemented before the rule of law, transparent markets and accountable institutions were sufficiently strong to make them work for the many. Today, modest signs of hope exist: trade deals with the EU, agricultural exports that remain competitive, civil society campaigns against corruption, and a diaspora that continues to send remittances and, in some cases, return with skills and capital. But sustainable recovery demands much more than individual heroism. Moldova must build a functioning state that enforces the rule of law, dismantles oligarchic control over the economy, invests in public goods, and secures external relationships that protect its sovereignty without sacrificing national development. It must rehabilitate damaged environments, modernize agriculture sustainably, and create real job opportunities that keep young people at home. Moldova's story is a cautionary tale about how fragile prosperity can be when institutions are weak and geopolitics are unforgiving. It is a story of how, despite rich soils and decades of development, a nation can be pushed to the margins by a lethal combination of historical trauma, resource dependence, and elite capture. And it is a story of endurance, of communities that, despite everything, keep living, farming, and hoping for a political and economic order that actually works for them. To turn that hope into reality will require a decisive and sustained commitment to transparency, justice, and economic inclusion, a Herculean task, but the only realistic path out of the impoverishment that pushed people in places like Minji to make choices none of us would want to imagine. Thank you for watching. If you want more deep dives on economics and politics, subscribe to World Economy.